Tennessee This Week from WATE 6 on your side starts now.
Coming up on Tennessee This Week, the Senate taking up the case against President Trump. A constitutional expert gives us a course in Impeachment 101. And Governor Bill Lee offering a comprehensive anti-abortion bill, including another try at the heartbeat ban. And Tennessee just went hands-free behind the wheel. Now a lawmaker wanting to undo it. You're watching Tennessee This Week on WATE 6 on your side. Hello and welcome to Tennessee This Week. I'm Blake Stevens. The impeachment process has moved into the Senate after arguing over subpoenas and witnesses Tuesday. On Wednesday, lawmakers moved into the trial itself. This making only the third time in U.S. history a presidential impeachment case has gone so far. Well, we've brought someone in to help make sense of it all and help put this into context. Constitutional law professor Stuart Harris from Lincoln Memorial University. Thanks for making time for us.
Well, thank you, Blake. It's a great pleasure to be here.
And you've been busy talking about impeachment. You actually, last week, you held a session, kind of a Q&A session at the Blunt Mansion to talk about impeachment. You dubbed it Impeachment 101.
Right.
So talk to us on its most basic level. What is impeachment? How do you explain it to the public?
Impeachment is a check that the Congress has on the executive and on the judiciary, the other two of the three government branches at the national level. So throughout its history, the Congress has impeached, I think, 19 people, most of them actually federal judges, but also two different presidents, or now three different presidents. The House impeaches, which means it accuses, it's like an indictment, and then once the impeachment articles are sent to the Senate has the sole power to have a trial. The only penalty for this trial is removal from office unless the Senate also says that you're further disqualified to serve in the future.
So it's either acquittal or guilty.
Acquittal or conviction, and conviction means removal, and it also might mean disqualification in the future from holding any public office of trust.
Okay, and there are a few topics on this topic of impeachment, or a few misconceptions that you have felt the need to really dig into. What are some of those?
Well, I've noticed a number of people saying that this is somehow unconstitutional. I've heard the term coup out there, and I'm not taking sides on this. You can be a Trump supporter or you can be a Democrat. I mean, it doesn't matter to me. My point is that this is very constitutional. This is right in Article 1. It's right in Article 2. These procedures have been followed multiple times in our past and no doubt will be followed in the future. So I actually wrote an article recently in the Journal of the Knoxville Bar Association, Dicta, in which I suggested to my fellow lawyers in Knoxville that we not engage in such name-calling, that we explain to people this is an essential aspect of our republic, the separation of powers between these three branches of government.
And maybe the partisan behavior that we're seeing. You said this is exactly what Alexander Hamilton, for example, said would happen.
In Federalist 65, the Federalist Papers were a series of newspaper articles that Hamilton and Madison and a fellow named John Jay wrote to support the ratification of the brand new Constitution. In Federalist Paper number 65, Hamilton talked about the impeachment process and how important it was to be able to remove a president who was acting against the national interest. I mean, the office of the presidency is extremely powerful, and people were very wary of it because they just fought a revolution against King George III. They did not want a king. And Hamilton said, we're going to give the power to try the impeachment to the Senate, and what's the Senate full of? It's full of politicians. So of course it's going to be political. But the hope was that whoever was in the Senate could rise above party politics and do what's right for the nation.
Where do we go from here? I know that we're taping this on a Thursday for it to air on Sunday, so a lot's going to happen between now and then. But what should we expect in the days ahead?
Well, of course, pretty much every pundit is saying that it's almost certain we're going to have an acquittal because it takes 2/3 of the Senate, or 67 senators, to vote to convict. And there's a majority of Republicans, and it does not seem that we're going to get to that point. So I think what's happening is that both sides, currently the Democrats, but then starting Saturday morning, I believe, the Republicans, are playing to the galleries. The Democrats are trying to bring out as much evidence as they can of malfeasance by the president, and they hope to use that in the election. And similarly, the Republicans are trying to do everything they can to prevent that from happening.
And East Tennessee has a couple connections to impeachment.
Yes.
Has a lot to do with why you had your event where you had it. So
Yes.
talk to us about that.
Well, most people in Knoxville, I'm sorry to say, have driven past Blunt Mansion, but have only the vaguest idea of what it is. It is the home of a signer of the United States Constitution. Now, the first time I heard that, I was a little bit confused. Tennessee didn't exist when the Constitution was signed, so how could we have a signer? Well, it turns out that North Carolina claimed the land that then later became Tennessee, and William Blount was from North Carolina. He was sent to the Constitutional Convention. He befriended George Washington. He signed the Constitution. Washington appointed him the governor of what was then called the Southwest Territory, and he shepherded Tennessee into existence. But then he kind of went off the rails, and he got impeached. He was sent to the Senate as one of Tennessee's first senators, and he got kicked out.
And he got kicked out. So one of the guys writing up the rules that he later got him.
He actually signed off on the impeachment articles, and then he got impeached himself.
So really quickly, your legal analysis on how the Senate went about allowing witnesses and the way they set up the trial, the argument over subpoenas. Does history tell us how those questions should be answered?
Well, history suggests that witnesses and other evidence are appropriate because in both of the impeachment trials we've had previously, the trial of Andrew Johnson, another East Tennessean, and of course Bill Clinton, there were witnesses and there was testimony. And indeed, simply speaking, as a lawyer, when I think of the word trial, I think of witnesses and testimony. I mean, the purpose of any trial, civil, criminal, or even an impeachment trial, is to get to the bottom of things and to find out what the facts are so then the court can act appropriately. And so, again, just speaking from my perspective, I wonder how you can have a trial without evidence.
So you're troubled by the way it's set up?
As an American citizen and as a lawyer, I think the majority of Americans want to know what happened. I don't know what happened. The president doesn't call me and tell me what he's done or hasn't done. He doesn't write, he doesn't call. I don't know. I would like to hear from eyewitnesses.
But as you've pointed out before, though, going back to that original document, the House has its abilities and the Senate has the ability to set the rules.
Absolutely. The Senate, constitutionally speaking, the Senate can do whatever the Senate wants to do on this. That's been very clearly stated by the U.S. Supreme Court. The question is, they're both sides. The Republicans and the Democrats are playing to us, the American people, for the 2020 election. And so the question becomes, what do you want to see? Do you want to know more, or do you want this simply to be over?
And you know, the U.S. went decades without an impeachment. Now we've had nearly 3 in the last 50-odd years. So do you think this is going to be routine in politics?
I'm so glad you said that, because I think of Richard Nixon as having been the most effective impeachment in history. He resigned after the House Judiciary Committee approved articles of impeachment, and so people will say he didn't technically get impeached by the House. But he left because he was about to get impeached. And that's the way I think it would always happen. Any president who sees the train coming down the tracks is going to resign.
And you said that has something to do with pension, actually, which...
I think he preserves his federal pension.
Which is another topic.
That's another thing to think about.
If we could switch topics entirely just for a moment to talk about the heartbeat abortion bill. So,
oh boy, that's whiplash, Blake.
It was.
Okay,
you know,
impeachment, abortion, okay, well, we'll do our best, won't we?
You can't rush experience. Okay. But my question to you is, where does this law stand now, and how would it stack, and how would this proposal stack up? Would it pass your constitutional muster?
Well, that's an interesting question. The current law, everyone says Roe versus Wade, but the relevant case is actually Casey versus Planned Parenthood from 1992. And Casey drew a bright line at the point of viability. So before a fetus is viable, the woman has the right to get an abortion, and the state cannot place an undue burden, that's the magic phrase, on her right to get an abortion. So the question with a heartbeat bill is, does that place an undue burden on the woman's right? And the question is timing. I mean, heartbeats, I'm not a doctor, I don't know exactly when, but they occur before viability. And so if you say you cannot have an abortion between the point where there's a heartbeat and the point where the fetus is viable, that sounds like an undue burden. This bill, like many other bills that have been passed by other states, conservative states, are actually direct challenges to Casey and to Roe. And I think that's the intent. You know, we're going to try to get these cases that on their face pretty much violate Roe and Casey, and we're going to try to get those cases overturned.
All right, Stuart Harris from LMU, thank you so much. Still to come, we turn to our panel of pundits to talk about the politics of impeachment. You're watching Tennessee This Week on WATE 6 on your side. We'll be right back. It's time now to hear from our panel of pundits. Joining us today, WATE 6 on your side, healthcare analyst Craig Griffith, Knox County Democratic Party Chair LaKenya Middlebrook, and Republican Executive Committee member James Corcoran. All right, guys, thanks for being here. So,
Thank you for having us.
We've had the conversation about impeachment a couple times, and I've heard it on this show a couple times that the president will not be removed. So I pose this question: what are we doing? What are we doing here, and where do we go?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, it's clear we're still in our silos on this particular issue. There was an interesting big study came out by the Pew Trust last week. It showed that nearly 2/3 of the Americans thought that Trump has done either something unethical or something violated the law. That's overwhelming to me. But if you dig down into the survey, it also says that 87% of the Republicans think he shouldn't be removed from office. So I don't think that there's any opinions that have been changed. And I've used this before on this program. We haven't seen that Perry Mason moment. We haven't seen that moment in the trial where everyone gasped and it brings it to a conclusion. And I don't think we're going to. I think it's going to be a straight party vote like I've been predicting ever since it came out of the House. So, you know, as the professor said, you know, these groups are playing to their bases. And that may be effective, but we'll have to wait till November of 2020 to find out.
What do you make of it, LaKenya?
Well, I think, you know, you asked the question, what are we doing? I think what we're doing is exercising our constitutional duty. The Constitution requires that the legislative branch be a check and balance on the executive branch. And, you know, it was just stated that we haven't had that Perry Mason moment, which I think a lot of people are waiting for, the shock and awe. But, you know, as James can attest to, most trials don't have that moment. It's about getting the facts out. It's about the jurors understanding what actually happened, and people being able to make an informed decision because of that. Now, if the jurors, in this case the senators, decide that they are not going to make a decision based on the facts that they hear, that they don't want to hear the facts, then that is, of course, their right because they make the rules. However, I think that the American people deserve to know what happened here, whether or not our national security was put at risk, whether or not there are, you know, concerns about the integrity of our elections, so that they can then make informed decisions going forward about how they want to be governed.
But you're not taking that view of it's a done deal.
I don't, you know, and I think that it's an uphill battle. But, you know, I don't know what's going to come out in the future. I don't know. A big issue is that we don't know everything. And perhaps there will be something that kind of breaks the dam and folks say this is a bridge too far. We don't know. I'm not overly optimistic that we are going to get the information that we need to make an informed decision, but I can't say that it will not absolutely happen.
James?
People have been talking about trying to undo the results of the 2016 election since Donald Trump won, you know, largely unexpected fashion. At the end of the day, to get the overwhelming majority of the Senate to care, we'd have to first make the people of America care in an overwhelming sense that we need to undo the results of that election. At the end of the day, I don't think people care that much about how quickly Ukraine got their aid. I think Americans want to know whether or not they're being taken care of, whether or not they've got jobs, whether or not they're in a position to care for their families. And at the end of the day, I just don't think that what was happening with Ukrainian aid ends up being that interesting, doesn't hit that close to home that people are going to get out of their silos.
And my next question, what were you?
Well, and it brings to the question of what exactly defines high crimes and misdemeanors. And I think that is where the Republicans in the Senate are going to put their draw the line in the sand. That whatever happened, and there doesn't seem to be much disagreement now on the facts of what's going on. But they just they don't feel that it reaches the bar of high crimes and misdemeanors.
And I find it very disheartening to think that we would say that the American people don't care whether or not the integrity of our elections is protected, or whether or not we are exercising our constitutional duties, or whether or not our national security is being protected as long as they have a job. I think that people want to see our systems work, and anytime that there is a threat to the systems working, then people are engaged and interested. In the Pew Research poll that you just mentioned suggests that the overwhelming majority of Americans want to know more.
And that brings me into my next question, and I'll let you field it first. Presidential candidates, does this help one party over the other? Does it hurt one? I mean, what do you make of the political ramifications of this?
Well, you know, I think it creates a challenge for specific candidates because some of them are senators and so they are off the campaign trail. But in terms of the party structures overall and whether or not it helps or hurts, I think that the conversations can be held simultaneously and actually need to be held simultaneously about engaging folks in not only the issues that are affecting their day-to-day lives, but also giving us an opportunity to talk about the overall structure and preserving the integrity of the system that we currently have, and whether or not we are going to allow that to be undermined, because if we allow it to be undermined for one person, we are setting ourselves up for it to be undermined by all people, and therefore the system that we currently recognize goes away, and the America that we know isn't anymore.
Integrity of our elections. There's not even anything in the articles of impeachment that has anything to do with our elections. That's like going back to this whole idea that Russia meddled in our elections, and there's nothing about it even so much in even what the House put out in a very partisan fashion. So the idea that this has something to do with the integrity of our elections is beyond the pale.
I think it very much has to do with the integrity of our elections. If we're talking about a sitting president using aid that has been approved by Congress, using that as a tool to engage a foreign country to announce, not even to investigate, but just to announce the investigation of a potential political rival with the effort to upset and influence people's decision-making, that undermines the integrity of our election. And you can call it something else, but that's what it is.
Well, they're almost two separate issues, because as James says, there is nothing in these impeachment articles that deal with election integrity. So, you know, there is no doubt that the Russians tried to interfere in our election in 2016. To what degree they were successful and to what degree they supported one candidate over the other is up to question. But our elections are at risk now. And I think that the federal government hasn't paid nearly enough attention to the fact that we can be attacked by a foreign government in cyberspace.
Well, if you guys don't mind, I want to switch from the federal government onto the state government and talk about Governor Bill Lee, who was flanked by a group of fellow Republican state lawmakers, now unveiled a new abortion bill covering a number of fronts Wednesday. It includes banning abortion after the detection of a fetal heartbeat, requiring someone seeking an abortion to view an ultrasound, and banning an abortion if a doctor believes it is motivated by the health, sex, disability, race, or race of the fetus. So my question to you all, will Tennessee voters support this measure, and do you believe it will stand up in court? I want to start with, well, we have two attorneys on this panel, don't we? James, I'll start with you.
And I don't even play one on TV, so what can I say?
I absolutely believe Tennessee voters will support it. However, at the end of the day, I think what this will have the practical effect of will be funding Planned Parenthood's lawyers, because I do think, at least under the current case law, it's most likely to be struck down as unconstitutional. And if the goal is to get constitutional challenges to get up to the Supreme Court, hoping that there's a new balance on the court and that change is going to happen, those cases are already going on from laws from other states.
Like Alabama, right? The Alabama law.
There's plenty of heartbeat laws that have already passed that are already working their way through the court system. At the end of the day, this is just spending Tennesseans' money.
Kenya?
I actually agree with James in the fact that this is a waste of Tennesseans' money. I think it's a waste of legislative time. There are so many other issues that are impacting Tennesseans that would actually benefit the life of everyday Tennesseans. When we think about the fact that we have, I think about 15% or so of our population living in poverty, 42% of black children live in poverty. I think about back in last session, on the same day that a similar bill was debated on the floor, there was legislation voted down in committee that would have allowed school systems to make sure that students who had lunch debt were still able to receive healthy lunches and the same lunches that their classmates were receiving. And so when we talk about wanting to promote life, there are a lot that we could be doing to improve the lives of Tennesseans. And I think that promoting this anti-choice legislation and suggesting that women are not capable of making choices for their own bodies and their own families with their own doctors is very much overreaching and unnecessary. It's disheartening, and I hope that Tennesseans will stand up against this legislation.
You know, Craig, we're getting into the legality of this and the ethics of this. My question, is this what Tennesseans want, in your view?
Well, I think you'd have to go back 4 years to, there was an amendment on the state ballot 4 years ago about, there was a concept in the Tennessee state constitution that sort of guaranteed a right to an abortion. An amendment went on to the ballot, and it was voted down in a relatively close race, but this amendment won, and it removed that absolute right to an abortion out of the Tennessee state.
So it's like a referendum.
Yeah, it was a statewide referendum on it was called Amendment 1A. So yes, Tennessean voters probably would support that. But yes, there are many other things that we could be discussing now that the legislators could address that won't down the road, I think, definitely be overturned by a court. And I'm really wondering why, you know, with the current makeup of the Supreme Court, why they didn't wait until a decision was made on Roe v. Wade, and that right to an abortion was either upheld or denied on the federal level. Then they could have moved in, called a special meeting of the legislature and banned abortions in Tennessee if that Roe v. Wade is overturned.
All right, guys, thanks for that. Still to come, after voting to require hands-free devices for Tennessee drivers, a state lawmaker says the new law needs to be undone. You're watching Tennessee This Week from WATE 6 on your side. Hey, welcome back to Tennessee This Week. Well, the conversation's still going now with Craig Griffith, LaKenya Middlebrook, and James Corcoran. All right, an East Tennessee state lawmaker proposing an end to the hands-free cell phone law for people who want to talk on the phone while they drive. State Senator John Lundberg pushing to repeal that act, saying it's not stopping Tennesseans from driving distracted. Senator Lundberg saying it's instead encouraging Tennesseans to be more discreet with their phone use, potentially making them more distracted. So I don't remember who I started with last, but Craig, I'm just going to get your take on this.
Well, you know, we discussed that ad nauseum, you know, when that bill came up. And if you're talking about distracted driving, are you going to ban the use of your radio in the car? Because it's been shown how many accidents have been caused when people are pushing the buttons on the radio. So there's a multitude of things that can distract you from driving. And I think that this requiring the use of hands-free is something that isn't going to make us safer. So I would probably agree with overturning that, and let's come up with some, you know, common sense when we're on the road about when to use your phone and when not to use your phone.
So come up with something else. LaKenya?
Well, it is a challenging topic. You know, I think about my own personal life. I have a very personal experience with losing someone that I love very much because of a distracted driver. However, I think that, you know, with any regulation, looking at whether or not it's feasible, whether or not it's workable, and whether or not there are other solutions. And I think most important is educating folks on the dangers of distracted driving, because we can legislate it all day, and especially, you know, when you're talking about a moving vehicle, it's really hard to implement that and to enforce it. But really thinking about how we better educate folks on the dangers of distracted driving and how we can legislate it in a responsible and feasible way.
James?
Strongly dislike the original law. I think it disproportionately impacts poor folks who can't afford fancy new things like Bluetooth and other things in their car. And you know, I could eat a foot-long sandwich under the current law in my car as I drive with my feet, and apparently that's legal, but holding a phone off to the side, maybe or maybe not looking at it, is illegal. And I just, at the end of the day, I think educating drivers and being more responsible is a better way than what we're trying to do.
I remember George Corder bringing up the food point, and I remember getting hungry right after he said it, and it's happened tonight. All right. On to county news. Knox County Commissioners, they're set to vote on the proposed school system move from the Andrew Johnson building to the TVA East Tower. Mayor Jacobs backing it, so is the superintendent, so is the University of Tennessee, which would be subleasing some of that space. This looks like it's near the finish line. I'm curious, have you all seen these types of projects save tax dollars long term? James, we'll start with you.
That one's going to be kind of a close call. The question is going to be, are they actually going to get enough money for the sale of the building that they're in right now? I mean, I don't think they're going to get actual market value for it. It's going to be really expensive to move a lot of people there. So at the end of the day, it runs the risk of at least being a net wash.
Okay, I have about 15 seconds. So sorry, guys. LaKenya.
Yeah, I think, you know, this is a really challenging one. Obviously, they are outgrowing the space that they're in and need to move and looking for opportunities. It could potentially be a great opportunity being in the same space with the University of Tennessee. But also, I've talked to several school board members who are talking to their constituents about the ease in accessing the building. And so I think it's a challenging one.
Usually when the numbers are on your side, and they're certainly on Mayor Jacobs' side on this issue, the amount of money he projects being saved by making this move is striking. So I think the numbers in the end will save the day and it will be approved. There are issues with access with the real IDs and things like